Hollywood. The name conjures gleaming chrome, gilded studios, and triumphant faces. We remember the effortless charm, the silken gowns, the promise of eternal, flawless perfection. But look closer. Peel back the blinding lights of the 1930s and 40s. Beneath that dazzling facade, a corrosive secret was poisoning the industry's heart. For some of the biggest icons of the golden age, the stars who promised us joy, fame was a prison, and their only escape was the bottom of a glass, or the quick, lethal oblivion of a pill bottle. This is a deep dive into the 19 shattered lives of actors who literally drank and medicated themselves to the brink, consumed by the very system that created them. These are the vintage legends who couldn't stay sober. Wallace Reid. Wallace Reid was, by all accounts, the golden boy of early Hollywood, handsome, athletic, and exuding the kind of natural charm that made him one of the most beloved leading men of the silent film era. Known to fans as the screen's perfect lover, Reid embodied the modern American ideal, clean-cut, masculine, and effortlessly magnetic. His star power was immense, his films consistently drew crowds, and his on-screen persona helped define what it meant to be a matinee idol in the 1910s and early 1920s. But behind that flawless image was a tragic story of physical pain, relentless pressure, and a devastating descent into addiction, one that would end far too soon and expose the dark underbelly of the studio system. Reid's downward spiral began not with moral weakness or self-indulgence, but with the brutal physical demands of early filmmaking. During the production of a film, he suffered serious injuries in a train accident. Rather than allowing him the rest and recovery any ordinary person would need, the studio, eager to protect its most profitable investment, pushed him back to work almost immediately. To dull the pain and keep him functional on set, doctors prescribed morphine, a common medical practice at the time, but one poorly understood in terms of its addictive potential. As the months passed, what began as pain management evolved into dependence. The studio system of that era thrived on overwork. Stars were expected to churn out multiple films a year, with little regard for personal well-being. Reid, ever the professional, obliged. He maintained his polished image, performing through injuries and exhaustion, while privately battling an addiction that worsened with every production. His workload was punishing, and so was the pressure. Studios feared any hint of weakness might tarnish the wholesome public image that sold millions of movie tickets. By the early 1920s, Reid's condition had deteriorated severely. Addiction treatment was primitive, and public understanding of substance abuse was practically non-existent. There were no proper rehabilitation centers, no psychological support, and certainly no compassion from the film executives whose profits depended on his continued output. When his health finally gave out, Reid collapsed on set, forcing the studio to confront the consequences of its exploitation. He was admitted to a sanatorium in a desperate attempt to overcome his addiction, but his body was too damaged to recover. In January 1923, Wallace Reid died at just 31 years old from pneumonia and complications brought on by years of drug use and exhaustion. The tragedy did not end with his death. Hollywood's response was chillingly transactional. Reid's illness and death were cynically used to promote his final films and the commercial products he had endorsed. Newspaper headlines romanticized his struggle while conveniently glossing over the industry's role in his downfall. Even in death, he was treated as a commodity, his personal suffering repackaged as publicity material. Yet his death sent shockwaves through Hollywood. The scandal forced studios to re-examine their image and prompted public outcry about the moral and ethical responsibilities of the film industry. Reid's demise became a catalyst for the introduction of moral turpitude clauses in actor contracts, controversial policies designed to protect studios from the reputational damage caused by the personal failings of their stars. Ironically, these clauses were meant to safeguard Hollywood's image, not its people. Wallace Reid's story remains one of the earliest and most haunting cautionary tales of the entertainment world. It exposed how the glitz of Hollywood could conceal brutal exploitation, and how even its brightest stars were ultimately dispensable in the pursuit of profit. Barbara Lamar. Known as the girl who was too beautiful, Barbara Lamar was the living embodiment of early Hollywood glamour and one of its first great cautionary tales. With her striking dark features, luminous eyes, and an aura of irresistible mystery, Lamar captivated audiences and filmmakers alike during the early 1920s. She was more than just a screen beauty. She was a symbol of the new, liberated woman that post-World War I, America was both fascinated by and afraid of. But beneath the glittering fame and the smoky allure of her screen persona lay a fragile reality, a young woman consumed by the very system that built her up. Barbara La Mar's career burned bright and fast. Before she was an actress, she made a name for herself as a dancer, writer, and socialite, often seen in the company of Los Angeles's elite. Hollywood quickly took notice of her magnetic presence, casting her in a series of films that cemented her image as a seductive femme fatale. Yet behind her rising success was a life spinning increasingly out of control. The pressures of constant publicity, demanding film schedules, and the expectations of maintaining a flawless image in an unforgiving industry drove her towards self-destructive habits. Hollywood in the 1920s was a world intoxicated by its own newness, a glittering playground of jazz-age excess, wild parties, and dangerous indulgences. La Mar fit seamlessly into that scene, but it came at a price. Known for her love of nightlife and her refusal to conform to the moral codes of her time, she was often portrayed in the press as both enchanting and scandalous. Her health began to decline as her dependence on alcohol and drugs grew. Yet despite the visible toll it took, the studios kept her working, valuing her box office appeal over her well-being. By her late 20s, Barbara's once vibrant appearance had begun to fade. Years of overwork, substance abuse, and illness left her frail and exhausted. She reportedly suffered from tuberculosis and other complications that worsened with her addiction. Even so, Hollywood, ever hungry for spectacle, continued to cast her in roles that capitalized on her beauty and mystique. When she finally collapsed under the weight of it all, her death in 1926 at just 29 years old sent shockwaves through the entertainment world. The media sensationalized every detail of her demise, turning her suffering into public spectacle. Headlines mourned the girl who was too beautiful to live, transforming her death into a morality tale about the dangers of fame, indulgence, and the seductive chaos of Hollywood. Studio executives, already rattled by the deaths of Wallace Reed and other early stars, used her story to reinforce the narrative that actors' private behavior reflected on the industry as a whole. Her passing became a definitive turning point, strengthening the studio's resolve to protect their reputations at all costs. Alongside Reed's tragedy, La Mar's death gave studio heads the justification they needed to impose strict moral turpitude clauses in contracts, provisions that allowed studios to fire or punish actors for any conduct deemed immoral, indecent, or damaging to the studio's public image. Ostensibly created to prevent further scandals, these clauses were, in truth, mechanisms of control. They allowed studios to maintain a pristine facade while forcing stars to hide their struggles behind closed doors. Addiction, affairs, and emotional breakdowns were to be buried, not treated. Though Barbara La Mar's story has often been overshadowed by later legends of Hollywood tragedy like Marilyn Monroe and Judy Garland, her life and death laid the groundwork for how the industry handled scandal for decades. She became a symbol of both the intoxicating allure and the destructive cost of stardom. Behind the studio lights and camera flashes, she was a woman caught between the fantasy Hollywood created and the impossible standards it demanded her to live up to. Barbara La Mar's beauty became both her blessing and her curse, the quality that made her unforgettable and the one that led to her undoing. Jean Eagles. Jean Eagles was not merely an actress, she was a force of nature, a performer whose presence could electrify an entire theater. Hailed as one of the most gifted and intense actresses of her generation, she brought an emotional realism to the stage that was far ahead of its time. Before she became a Hollywood figure, Eagles was already a celebrated Ziegfeld girl, captivating audiences with her magnetism and poise. But what truly set her apart was her extraordinary ability to channel raw emotion through restraint. She mastered what critics would later call the art of listening, a subtle and revolutionary approach that made every scene she touched feel alive. Her artistry, however, came at a great personal cost. Eagles was fiercely dedicated to her craft, often pushing herself beyond the limits of human endurance. The grueling schedule of stage performances, combined with the rising pressures of transitioning into film during Hollywood's shift from silent pictures to sound, placed her under unbearable strain. To cope, Jean turned to self-medication, a dangerous cocktail of sleeping pills, alcohol, and, reportedly, more potent substances that dulled the exhaustion but deepened her dependency. As the pressures mounted, so did her reputation for being difficult. Directors and producers complained of her unpredictability and mood swings, while those close to her understood she was trapped in a cycle of overwork and emotional depletion. Despite the chaos behind the scenes, audiences rarely saw her falter. On stage and screen, Eagles remained mesmerizing. Her performances in plays like Rain were hailed as some of the most emotionally truthful ever delivered by an American actress. The tragedy of Jean Eagles lies not only in her premature death, but in the complete absence of psychological or professional support for artists of her era. Mental health was misunderstood, addiction was stigmatized, and the notion of rest was seen as weakness. Eagles was expected to be brilliant at all times, an impossible standard for any human being. By 1929, her body could no longer keep up with the demands placed upon it. The endless cycle of work, sleepless nights, and substance use culminated in her sudden collapse. She died later that year at just 39 years old, reportedly from the effects of narcotics and alcohol, though the exact cause was debated for decades. W.C. Fields was one of the few actors who successfully commercialized his intoxication. His cinematic persona as a misanthropic, perpetually drunk juggler was immensely popular, and his professional longevity was directly tied to his vice. Fields' heavy drinking in real life gave him the distinct physical appearance, the bulbous red nose and blotchy face, that was essential to his convincing act. This commercialization allowed him to operate outside the strict moral codes that crushed others. However, the persona provided professional longevity while ensuring his personal tragedy. Fields, who famously disliked Christmas, died on Christmas Day 1946 in Pasadena, California, a lonely alcoholic. He reportedly drank nothing stronger than beer until he was 12, but his adult life was defined by the chronic condition that ultimately claimed him. John Barrymore. The great profile John Barrymore carried the burden of inherited struggle. His father was an alcoholic. Barrymore possessed a sardonic wit that often turned his addiction into a darkly celebrated intellectual stance. He famously quipped, "You can't drown yourself in a drink. I've tried. You float." His increasing dependence on alcohol fueled erratic and bizarre behavior, led to numerous missed performances, and contributed to his marital problems, creating a vicious cycle where unhappiness increased the drink, and drink increased the unhappiness. Barrymore worried about inheriting his father's mental decline, and his alcoholism, being a depressant, often exacerbated the anxiety he sought to drown. This struggle culminated in his death in 1942 from alcohol-related liver cirrhosis at the age of 60. His life was a theatrical masterpiece ruined by a pervasive, cynical dependency that became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Helen Morgan. A major star of the Ziegfeld Follies, Helen Morgan embodied the aching allure of the Jazz Age. Known for her haunting torch songs and her ability to turn heartbreak into art, she became the voice of a generation caught between glittering excess and private despair. On stage, perched famously atop a piano in smoke-filled speakeasies, Morgan exuded an intoxicating mix of vulnerability and sophistication. Her voice carried the weariness of lost love and the wistful glamour of a world built on illusions. Her career, however, was inseparable from the very culture that ultimately destroyed her. The entertainment scene of the 1920s and 1930s thrived in underground clubs where alcohol flowed freely despite the ban, and Morgan was both a product and a victim of that environment. Behind her mesmerizing performances lay a woman quietly battling dependence and deteriorating health. As her fame grew, so did her reliance on alcohol to cope with the pressures of performing and the instability of life in show business. The very songs that made her famous, filled with longing, regret, and unfulfilled desire, echoed her real-life pain. By the late 1930s, Morgan's drinking had taken a devastating toll. Her voice weakened, her health declined, and her once bright career dimmed. In 1941, at just 41 years old, Helen Morgan died from alcohol-induced liver cirrhosis. Her death marked the end of an era and served as a sobering reflection on the contradictions of show business in the Jazz Age. F. Scott Fitzgerald. Although best known as the chronicler of the Jazz Age, F. Scott Fitzgerald spent his final, most desperate years working in Hollywood as a scriptwriter. He chased financial solvency in the studio system, but instead found creative exhaustion and compromise that fatally compounded his long-standing chronic alcoholism. Fitzgerald represents the intellectual elite who discovered that the Hollywood machine was not a creative sanctuary, but a relentless mill that exacerbated existing vulnerabilities. The stress, demanding deadlines, and perceived failures contributed to his decline. He died in 1940, aged 44, in Hollywood from an alcohol-induced heart condition, linking the physical toll of addiction directly to the spiritual and creative drain of the movie industry. Judy Garland. Judy Garland's story is the definitive case of industrial chemical abuse in Hollywood. Her struggles began in childhood, where studio executives at MGM introduced her to a brutal regime of amphetamines and barbiturates to control her weight, energy, and sleep during demanding work schedules. She was chemically manipulated from adolescence to fit the studio's massive output demands. This systematic dependency transitioned into a lifelong struggle with both drugs and alcohol, involving cyclical attempts at treatment. The irony is profound. While the era, 1923-1965, aggressively enforced narcotics control and persecuted drug users, the studios themselves were complicit in creating her dependence. Despite her immense talent, Garland was tossed between uppers and downers like a ping-pong ball. Her tragedy culminated in her death in 1969 from a barbiturate overdose at age 47. Errol Flynn. Errol Flynn embodied the reckless spirit of the Golden Age, known equally for his swashbuckling on-screen roles and his off-screen reputation as a Hellraiser's Hellraiser. His life became a performance of machismo and excess, fueled primarily by flagrant womanizing and heavy drinking. Flynn's alcohol consumption was epic. While he enjoyed champagne and fine French wines, he was chiefly devoted to dark spirits, eventually turning to vodka, consuming well over a bottle a day. The intense lengths he went to conceal his habit are perhaps the most telling detail. When restricted from drinking on set, he reportedly injected vodka into oranges to sneak the substance past studio security. Flynn's rapid physical decline led to his death in 1959 at only 50 years old. Montgomery Clift. Montgomery Clift arrived in Hollywood as a sensitive, magnetic actor known for his quiet intensity. His alcoholism and dependence on painkillers were drastically accelerated by a devastating 1956 car accident that left him with severe facial injuries. The accident marked a definitive before and after line in his life. Clift relied increasingly on alcohol and pain medication to manage chronic pain and the psychological trauma of his physical change. His struggles were so public that friend Marlon Brando once attempted an intervention, telling him, "Knock off the shit, you're killing yourself," only to leave in anger, concluding that Clift was a lost cause. Clift spent his final years haunted and deteriorating, turning his career into what many observers called the longest suicide, where trauma merged seamlessly with addiction. The vodka bottle became an ever-present fixture in his final painful years. Richard Burton. Richard Burton, a celebrated stage and screen actor, possessed both high intelligence, as reflected in his cultured diaries, and a legendary, catastrophic thirst. His struggle with drinking was a central part of his life, and his turbulent, famous relationship with Elizabeth Taylor. The staggering scale of his dependency is captured in a promise he made to a director while filming the 1972 movie Under Milk Wood. Burton vowed to limit his consumption to only 1 bottle of vodka a day, explaining, "I'm sober on 2, but when I'm drinking, it is 3 or more." Burton's high functioning, his ability to deliver stellar performances and write eloquent observations while consuming lethal amounts of alcohol, served as a catastrophic denial mechanism, delaying the intervention necessary until his body failed. Humphrey Bogart. Humphrey Bogart turned drinking into something larger than a habit. He made it an art form, a statement, even a philosophy. To millions, he was the embodiment of cool detachment, the weary truth-teller in a corrupt world. With a cigarette in one hand and a glass in the other, Bogart crafted one of Hollywood's most iconic archetypes, the cynical, whiskey-soaked anti-hero who understood life's disappointments too well to ever pretend otherwise. His characters endured pain, drink in hand, with a sardonic grin. What made Bogart so compelling was how seamlessly his real life and on-screen persona blurred together. He didn't just play the hard-drinking loner, he was one. His fondness for alcohol was well known around Hollywood, and he often framed it as a matter of principle rather than weakness. To Bogart, drinking wasn't about indulgence, it was about authenticity. His famous quips, "The problem with the world is that everyone is a few drinks behind," and "I gave up drinking once, it was the worst afternoon of my entire life," weren't just jokes. They were part of a carefully constructed worldview, one that turned self-destruction into an act of defiance. This blend of wit, grit, and visible vulnerability made him irresistible to audiences. He sold the image of the world-weary man who drank not out of excess, but out of understanding, someone who saw too much of life's hypocrisy to stay sober through it all. His portrayal of Rick Blaine in Casablanca epitomized that ethos, a man torn between love and cynicism, nursing both his drink and his heartbreak. The irony, of course, was that while his drinking was celebrated as part of his mystique, it was also a real and serious dependency that chipped away at his health. In the end, his defiance caught up with him. Bogart's years of heavy drinking and smoking contributed to his decline, culminating in his death from esophageal cancer in 1957 at the age of 57. Yet even in death, his legend remained untouched. If anything, his hard-living ways only amplified it. Robert Mitchum. Robert Mitchum represents the rare case where a major scandal actually bolstered a star's career, proving that the studio system's moral code was malleable based on commercial viability. Known for playing heavies and hard-boiled characters, Mitchum was arrested in 1948 for marijuana possession. Under normal circumstances, the moral turpitude clause would have ended his contract. Instead, his studio, RKO, chose to stand by him. After serving 50 days in jail, Mitchum returned to Hollywood an even bigger star. His brief incarceration cemented his rebellious anti-establishment image, validating the persona he brought to his films. Although his arrest centered on marijuana, a highly publicized offense at the time that drew the attention of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics Commissioner, his hard-living lifestyle placed him perpetually on the edge of violating Hollywood's strict moral conduct rules. Yet, despite the controversy, his career not only survived, but continued to thrive on that very edge. William Holden. William Holden, long celebrated as one of the industry's most charismatic leading men, was no stranger to the bottle. Behind the confident smile and rugged charm that made him a screen legend lay years of quiet dependence and self-neglect. By the late 1970s, Holden's drinking had become more than a habit. It was a defining part of his life. Colleagues and friends often spoke of his warmth and intelligence, but also of the melancholy that seemed to shadow him in his later years. Though he remained a respected actor with unforgettable performances in Sunset Boulevard, Stalag 17, and Network, his off-screen battles were taking a visible toll. The confident idol of Hollywood's golden age was growing increasingly solitary, his drinking no longer a social pastime but a form of escape. In November 1981, the inevitable tragedy struck. While intoxicated at his Santa Monica apartment, Holden reportedly stumbled and fell, striking his head on the sharp corner of a bedside table. Disoriented and unable to seek help, he bled to death alone. It wasn't liver failure or heart disease that claimed him, but a simple fall, the kind of everyday accident made fatal by the loss of balance, coordination, and awareness that chronic intoxication brings. Veronica Lake. Veronica Lake, instantly recognizable for her iconic peekaboo hairstyle and femme fatale roles, experienced one of the most brutal and public career collapses. By the late 1940s, her career rapidly deteriorated, largely attributed to her deepening alcoholism. Unlike the celebrated male drinkers, Lake's personal struggles led directly to professional abandonment. Her final years were characterized by extreme isolation and financial difficulties. She died in 1973, at age 50, from hepatitis and acute kidney injury, following years of heavy consumption. Her ashes were reportedly left unclaimed for years due to unpaid funeral expenses, demonstrating the complete, devastating abandonment by the industry that had once worshipped her. Gail Russell. Gail Russell's trajectory was tragically swift. Discovered at 17, she was immediately thrust into the spotlight, named Star of Tomorrow by exhibitors in 1947. Despite this early success, she struggled intensely with emotional problems and a crippling drinking problem throughout her brief career. Russell lacked the psychological foundation to cope with the sudden, intense pressure of fame, leading to alcohol becoming her immediate and constant escape. Her professional difficulties meant she was quickly discarded by the system. She died alone in 1961, aged just 36, in her modest Westwood home. She was found on the floor, an empty vodka bottle beside her. Her solitary death serves as a profound metaphor for the vulnerability of the ingenue exposed to the system's demands without adequate support. Alan Ladd. Alan Ladd projected an image of stoic, controlled masculinity in films like Shane. However, beneath this tough exterior lay deep depression and a serious escalating problem with alcohol abuse. The pressure to maintain his heroic image meant that his psychological distress had to be ruthlessly suppressed. The studio, in its constant vigilance over image, even covered up an earlier suicide attempt. This act of concealment shows the enormous price of maintaining the masculine ideal, the inability to seek genuine help. Ladd ultimately died in 1964, aged 50, from an accidental overdose involving a lethal combination of alcohol and sedatives. Lillian Roth. Lillian Roth, a major Broadway and MGM star, experienced a 16-year struggle with alcoholism and mental illness rooted in the controlling pressure of the industry, specifically her relentlessly ambitious stage mother. In 1954, Roth achieved something groundbreaking. She published I'll Cry Tomorrow, a courageous, best-selling memoir that detailed her harrowing fall from fame to shame. The book was unique in its unflinching honesty and predated the widespread recovery movement, providing one of the first major public cracks in the glamorous Hollywood facade. Roth transformed the narrative from one of moral scandal to one of disease rooted in trauma and control. Her memoir served as an early framework for compassionately understanding celebrity addiction, particularly from a woman's perspective, paving the way for later stars to share their own recovery journeys. Elizabeth Taylor. Elizabeth Taylor, whose stardom spanned from the golden age well into the modern era, spent decades grappling with dependency on both prescription drugs and alcohol. Her struggles were intensely public, often played out alongside her volatile marriages, most famously to Richard Burton. Taylor's life is crucial because she was one of the few Golden Age stars who survived their initial chemical entrapment and lived long enough to seek modern professional treatment. Her later willingness to openly discuss her struggles and become an advocate for addiction treatment and related mental health issues helped destigmatize the disease. While her battles began in the closed, chemically dependent environment of the studio system, her ultimate path provided a bridge to the contemporary view of addiction as a treatable medical condition, demonstrating that recovery is achievable even from the deepest depths of celebrity dependence. And there you have it, 19 haunting stories that peel back the glittering facade of old Hollywood to reveal a much darker truth beneath the spotlight. Behind the fame, the beauty, and the carefully crafted public images were men and women trapped in an era that didn't understand addiction, not as a disease, but as a moral failure. There were no proper rehab centers, no therapy, no compassion, just punishment, shame, and the looming threat of career destruction under the infamous moral turpitude clauses that ruled the industry. These stories remind us that the Golden Age wasn't always golden. It was often cruel, cold, and unrelenting toward those who dared to fall apart. But what do you think? Do you believe the studio system was to blame for these tragedies, or were these stars simply victims of their own fame? And which of these stories struck you the most? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoyed this deep dive into Hollywood's hidden history, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more untold stories from behind the screen.